Let's get started. I'm Dan Rundy. I hold the Schreier Chair here at CSIS. We're going to have a conversation about whether or not we need to revisit the concept of U.S. enterprise funds. U.S. enterprise funds were launched in the early 1990s by George H.W. Bush. Were country-focused, where U.S. government dollars funded investments in developing countries. It was an idea that was ahead of its time. There were several dozen of these enterprise funds that were launched. Many of them were very successful. Some that had some hiccups, but most were broadly very successful. But you would ask yourself, well, why hasn't, there's any number of different countries where you would say we ought to be applying this. Thankfully, in the Obama administration, there were a number of countries where there was political will to apply this tool, and I think it's a very valid and useful tool for our toolkit in the United States. So we have examples from Tunisia and Egypt that we're going to talk about as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about the history of what are these things, how they come about, what can we learn from the past, how are some of the more recent ones operating. And then finally, I think the most important thing is about the future, because I think there's, in some ways, it was certainly ahead of its time, and there's a lot of learnings from the past. But I think there are plenty of countries where we ought to be applying this in new additional countries, but also maybe in different ways, given the fact that the world has changed from say 25 years ago, and so the instrument needs to adapt with the times. So we've got a very experienced group of panelists. I'm really pleased to have all these smart folks on the panel. I'm not going to go into detailed bios for each of them, but I'm going to ask my friend PAIGE Alexander, who's the Executive Director of European Cooperative for Rural Development, but is more importantly a former USAID Assistant Administrator and someone who was one of the point people on enterprise funds in several points in her career, but most recently during the Obama administration. So PAIGE, thanks for flying in from Brussels to be here, and then I'll introduce each of the panelists before they speak. So PAIGE, why don't you just start and give us a little bit of context here on the enterprise funds, if you would, please.
Sure. Thanks, Dan. Well, I see so many people in the audience who actually know more about enterprise funds than I do, having spent numerous years working on them. So I'll just give you a brief sort of perspective that I have, having come in 1993 and sort of seen what it was like through the 90s, the early 2000s, and then had the colleagues with Bo and Jim, seeing what they were like when they started up again in 2012. So I think enterprise funds were truly designed for a solution to a problem in a very specific context. And Kim will be able to talk more about that, because what we had in the 90s and the early 2000s, as we were looking at a dual mandate of how does the US government get involved in these countries in a quick way that we can get quick results. Poland and Hungary were the ones that were going through shock therapy. President Bush wanted to announce something. These were designed in a vacuum of, okay, the US government does not have the technical expertise to look at private equity, venture capital. This is not what we do. We can hire private boards who can go in and set up these enterprise funds. I don't think, and there are probably other congressional staffers here who can attest to the fact that no one thought these were going to be financially viable or sustainable. So there was not a lot of thought done to what happens after liquidation. So then we spent most of 2010 onwards trying to figure out what to do about liquidation, legacy funds, things that we could do to leave behind. But backing up to the enterprise fund at this point, the creation happened so quickly, and with the dual mandate of you need to transition these countries to a market economy, yet at the same time you need to make money. And then the mandate of development was sort of left to the accord of each individual board as to how much of it would be truly development for development purist's sake, or was it going to be, we'll set up an airport in Albania, we'll set up a banking sector in Bulgaria, we'll work with mortgage lending in the Baltics. These things were decided amongst the private sector boards. So USAID's oversight and the State Department's oversight became somewhat tenuous as Congress continued to ask questions, what is it that you're doing? How quickly are they going to be able to react? And so we went through a growth period over 25 years, and I believe a report will be coming out soon as to what these enterprise funds and the legacies have left behind 25 years later. And I see, other members from a legacy fund. I'm actually a member of the Romanian American Legacy Fund. I see Craig from the Russian one. There are a number of people who are still part of this and are actively involved. But Dan's question is truly, what can we do in an enterprise fund version 2.0? The specific context of the NIS left us in a position to deal with very effective and educated people who just didn't have financial institutions in place and banking sectors in place. Those were things that fortunately Kim and a number of people who were on the boards of those funds were able to jumpstart. And USAID's continued oversight of that has gone from just the ambassador being involved to having 1,001 questions asked of you. And when the enterprise fund started in 2011 and 12 after the Arab Spring, no one really knew what the relationship was going to be. And I'll let Jim and Bo talk more about that. But I think the unique challenge is that we had an enterprise fund as a new innovative tool have grown over time. We have USAID has Feed the Future. It's got Development Credit Authority. There's Power Africa. There are a lot of innovative tools, and I've actually moved overseas, and I'm working on public partnerships with the Dutch government to look at other innovative ways to bring private sector in, so it's not just a public set of funding that has to go in to jumpstart some of these economies. So, I would say that on a whole, they've been blissfully successful. There are a couple that were unfortunately had de minimis returns at the end of the day. But when you look at the actual facts of $1.2 billion in financing going to 10 enterprise funds covering 14 countries, $6.9 billion in private capital being leveraged from that 1.2, and then $225 million being returned to Treasury at the end of it, that's a successful development program. And it's wonderful that they were able to do that at the time. And the question is, what can we do to expand on that and do something new in some of the newer countries?
Great, thank you. I want to skip over my Bo and Jim, and I want to ask Kim Davis to make some remarks. He's the chair of the Baltic American Freedom Foundation. He's also managing director and co-chair of the Charles Bank Capital Partners. But but more importantly, you chaired the Baltic Enterprise Fund, as well as you were the acting CEO of the Czechoslovakian Enterprise Fund earlier in your career. How did you end up getting those honorific jobs? Because those aren't paid jobs. You had a day job, but you were doing those on the. How did you end up getting that phone call, and why did you say yes?
Well, the first phone call was to join the Baltic American Enterprise Fund, and I thought it would be a really interesting way to observe the transition of post-Soviet countries, and so that was an easy yes. They needed people who had private equity experience, and I did that. The Czech and Slovak experience arose because one of our other directors was appointed by the White House as an acting board when the first board ran into some trouble. And that director asked me to step in as the acting CEO for 6 months, which I did in 1996, and essentially shut down the Czech operation and moved everything down to Slovakia, which was the only really business decision that was available to us at that time. I had a very funny meeting with the ambassador in the Czech Republic who said, "I'm glad to meet you, and I hope I never see you again after you leave the Czech Republic and the fund is out." So that was not a particularly successful one. But I would say, in general, anybody who thinks that enterprise funds will have a different distribution curve of investment success than in the private sector are missing the point. There will be some good deals and bad deals, and some good funds and some bad funds. And we have to simply accept that as a matter of course. Dan, if I might, we had a challenge that was very, very different than the one that Jim and Bo does, and I think a much more receptive environment. But just to give you a sense, I think the Baltic American Enterprise Fund was a successful enterprise fund. We started with $50 million in 3 countries. We made 3 very specific decisions. We were going to focus on the credit markets. We were not going to adopt a quota system. We were going to respond to market opportunities. And we were going to invest a lot in building our staff as a real legacy of what we're going to leave behind. We ended up with two businesses, a mortgage business and a mezzanine capital business. I think one of the mistakes that people make is they think that enterprise fund means being a private equity investor. I don't think that's true. Private equity in emerging markets with fragile legal structures is really difficult, whereas I think the credit markets are more open to innovation and to some development tools. Our $50 million turned into $820 million of invested capital, both with reflows and capital we leveraged. We originated 20,000 mortgages and accomplished the first securitization of a mortgage-backed security in Eastern Europe. So, for us, and we ended up with $60 million, and, you could say, gee, $60 million from 50 over 10 years is not a particularly great internal rate of return, but given three countries and given the 1998 Russia crisis and given our sort of development objectives, our view was that if we focused on preservation of capital and modest returns, investing in the quality of our staff and leaving a legacy behind of a more developed capital market, that we would have done our job. And we're still at it now as a legacy foundation. So while I don't think that what we did is necessarily replicable in the same way in Tunisia and Egypt because the geopolitical environments are so different, I do think that, I'd like to think that the Baltic American Enterprise Fund is at least an example of why the enterprise fund concept should have a second life, perhaps with some different rules in some different environments, but it is definitely a worthwhile endeavor. And the ability to leverage private sector volunteers, which we all are as board members, with USAID and State Department folks, as well as the local governments and local citizens, I think is a wonderful model of public diplomacy.
So Kim, how important is it to have the right board?
It is the number one and only thing. We were very lucky. We had 6 board members. We never met each other. We had the same 6 board members from 1994 to 2007. We had a great initial chair, Roz Ridgway, who had been Assistant Secretary of State under President Reagan. As an aside, by the way, the 2 most famous people in the Baltics when we got there were Pope John Paul II and Ronald Reagan. So we actually came into a pretty receptive environment, and Roz was a great leader to have in that. But the board is everything because the board has to exercise real oversight. We had active committees. We didn't micromanage management, but we absolutely knew what they were doing all the time. And I think that allowed us to change course when we had to, redirect resources when we had to, and innovate when we had to.
Okay. So what about when you started making money, and what happened? Did the government say, what do I do with this money? How did they, what was that conversation like?
So we sold all of our businesses in 2007. So in 2007, we liquidated, we sold our mezzanine capital business to a hedge fund, and we sold our mortgage bank, which by that time was a 140-person soup to nuts from origination to servicing platform to an Irish bank. And my friend Paige and I had spirited conversations about what to do with all of our money. And ultimately, we sent $25 million back to the Treasury, and we kept $35 million for our legacy foundation, which is hard at work as we speak.
Okay. So can you just spend a minute more on Czechoslovakia? Well, how did they find you, and what did they want you to do, and what did you do? So
the acting board asked me to step in as a CEO. I happened to have some time, and I was between sort of moves in my career, and I had 6 months available. So I took the job and flew to Prague. I think that's a story of a board that came in 1993 when the countries were together, 1991, and decided that their job was to just invest in anything and everything in minority equity positions in a country where there was just no legal framework or cultural understanding of what a private equity investment was, and it was just a mess. I mean, they lost, I think they lost about 75% of their capital in the first 2 years. And again, I've been in this business my entire life. I've made a lot of bad deals. You lose money, but they lost it at a rate that was beyond normal.
But Kim, let me just quickly jump in and say, did it have a happy outcome?
Well, we closed down the Czech activity, moved everything into Slovakia, and they did. They had a second go at it. I think they did some very good things in Slovakia. There's a legacy foundation there. It's unfortunate that we lost our ability to continue in the Czech Republic, but there was just no additional funding available given the history.
Okay, So it's fair to say it was somewhat turned around.
Yeah, it was turned around in a
right?
much smaller,
Okay.
with a much smaller footprint.
Okay, so that's the point I want people to come away with, that there were some hiccups, there were some interventions made, and then it had a pretty good turnaround outcome, right? Is that a fair way to describe it?
Yeah, it was. I mean, once we accepted the fact that we lost 75% of our capital, we did good things with the 25% that was remaining. But, I mean, to Dan's point, you know, again, people are going to lose money. You're going to make bad deals. You're going to get your hiccups, and you just have to learn how to absorb them and move on. And that's what we did.
Okay, all right, so I want to just spend one more minute on history, and then I want to turn to the present, to Jim and Bo talk about the present, and then I want the four of my panelists to talk about the future. But I just want to I want to dwell just 1 minute on the past with my friend Paige. Okay, so Paige, I think there's a historic memory of the enterprise funds. There's sort of a short list of complaints that some folks have. What if someone was here and said, well, what about that fund or this fund that I was unhappy about what happened here? What's your response to that? What would you say to some member of Congress that, well, I'm unhappy about this fund or this fund, and therefore we shouldn't do any more of these? What's your response to that?
David Coles will take all those questions. That's my response.
Right.
But if I were still at AID, I would say, I mean, yes, there were hiccups, and a lot of funds, the way they were liquidated at the end of the day, some had de minimis returns, the Central Asia Fund, the Slovak Fund, the Hungarian Fund, and they just sort of morphed into either legacy funds to do something small, but the majority of them ended up making unbelievable returns. I mean, Bulgaria, for example, although there were some concerns about it at the time, the Bulgaria Fund ended up walking away with $422 million at the end of the day for the legacy fund, and they only had to return $27 million to the U.S. government because the decision had been made at the time when Congress thought these were just funds that they were going to grant out. That the question was, do you return the liquidated assets, half of the liquidated assets to Treasury, or are you able to just return half of the initial grant? But regardless, the U.S. government got $225 million back from a development grant program, and that's just almost unheard of. I mean, that really is a broadly successful development program when you're returning money to the U.S. government. So I would say that each issue, as Kim mentioned, some of it were the board structure. They just weren't structured well, and there were incentives set in each of the boards that shouldn't have been there or were there for the wrong reasons, or it just wasn't a friendly environment. And I think Jim and Bo can talk a little bit more about the different in the environments that they're facing now versus what Ronald Reagan and the Pope, what Kim faced in the Baltics.
It was a simpler time.
Yeah, a much simpler time. And the U.S. was well loved, and it was helpful because you were able to do everything in conjunction with the host country government.
Okay, so Paige, let me just ask another leading question, which is, okay, so there's like 3 or 4 hiccup funds,
Right.
but there were like 12 or 14 funds that were great, right? That's the bumper sticker you should take away from this
Absolutely.
conversation, right? So when people say, yeah, there were a couple funds that had hiccups, yeah, that was the small minority of funds. Most of these were smashing successes. The other thing I think, Paige, it's fair to say is that the U.S. government and the fund boards themselves and the investment professionals had a lot of learning. As I said earlier, this was ahead of its time, and so there's been a lot of learning and improvement all along the way in the last 25 years. That's a fair statement too,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And I think congressional oversight, executive branch oversight, these are two things that also have had a lot of learning and growing to do, because as we had talked about earlier, Congress is coming at this from very different angles. Senator Lugar had wanted one thing. This is part of the reason the Baltic money had been held up. Lugar wanted one thing, Corker wants something else. It's very difficult to react to congressional wants and interests at the same time of policy imperatives to get things moving quickly, and looking at the market and recognizing these things weren't meant to move quickly. And they have a lifeline of 10 to 15 years for investment and reinvestment. So
my one last point is, Paige, while you were in the chair as assistant administrator, you asked the aid staff to put together all the lessons learned. I suspect some of the authors here are here in the audience, which is sort of, my view, is the must-read document on sort of where we are in the enterprise fund story. Could you just spend 1 second on
Sure.
that?
I think there are probably two must-read documents. One is available now, and it was done in 2013 with David Coles and a host of people from the Europe and Eurasia Bureau. And then there was another one that has been done recently. I think it hopefully will come out soon, that is on the overall legacy of enterprise funds. Both those documents stand as lessons learned for this type of innovative private sector, private capital activity.
Thank you. Okay, so that's enough about the past, but the point is, lots of learnings, lots of success, and learnings from the errors and improving upon the errors. That's the takeaway from the past on the enterprise funds. Okay, so let's move to the present. So let me start with my friend Jim Harmon first. So Jim, you got a phone call from Tom Nides and Mike Froman, two of the smartest people in the Obama administration, really phenomenal people, and they said, we need you to help stand up an enterprise fund in Egypt. What was your reaction to that, and why did you say yes to that?
Thanks, Dan. First, I want to congratulate you and the CSIS for doing it. It's a subject that warranted a review, and it's good to have the opportunity to discuss it with you. Secondly, you've invited some people who are very good illustrations of talented people, and I might even think they may be the best of a lot of the people who have run enterprise funds. So the audience can walk away thinking, wow, this is a very talented group of people. You should know, not everybody I have met who've taken on this assignment has been quite as effective as the group in front of you now. I got a call. I had served in the Clinton administration from 97 to 2001. I was chair of the Exim Bank. I have to admit, I didn't know what an enterprise fund was, and no one talked about enterprise funds at the Exim Bank during those 4 years. Maybe that was my fault, but I certainly heard very little about it. So obviously I said to Michael and Tom, I didn't really know what it was, so I'd have to think about it. I actually took 3 or 4 months, and government in the United States does not present you with a kind of background summary that helps you to make a decision. And so it was, I don't mean to be critical of anybody now, but it was 3 months later that I found that USAID did a very interesting and valuable study of whether or not they should have an enterprise fund in Egypt. How could I have worked 3 months and talked to everybody and no one gave me that? That's an illustration of, and I was part of the Clinton administration, so this was not a change of party. So can you imagine how our government treats someone from another party? In any case, we did do the study, and ourselves we did review, and I did make the decision sometime in April or May, 4 months later, that I would go forward. So the call was just a usual call. They had been, as you probably all know, once you leave the United States government, if you've been confirmed, it's not uncommon to get a call from someone in government to ask you to take assignments. So I had already had 4 or 5 assignments for limited areas to help the World Bank on this or that, and it didn't interfere too much with my day job. But my day job was running a fund that was investing in the frontier in the developing world, some 30 countries. So I had been following, obviously, the frontier developing world very closely since I left the government. Does that answer your question, Dan?
Yes. But Jim, what prompted you to say yes to this?
I don't know. My wife asks me that question often. When I'm stuck in the middle of traffic in Cairo during some demonstrations, I think to myself, what did prompt me to do that? But do you want me to give a little background?
Yes, please.
So first of all, you should all know the Egyptian Enterprise Fund was different than all the other enterprise funds in a few aspects, which prompted most former chairs to tell me they didn't think I should do it. First, the relationship between the United States and the Egyptian government was not very good. That may be a British understatement at that particular time. So unlike the European, where you were welcomed when you went to the country, on my first trip, the Egyptian government said, the $300 million that has been authorized for the Egyptian Enterprise Fund is our money. You're taking our money. It came out of the Camp David Accords and so forth and so forth back in the 1970s. And what is your explanation for that? Of course, that was way above my pay scale, and I had no answer for that. But the White House hadn't briefed me on the fact that this was going to come at me on a regular basis from certain people. So the relationship between the two countries were strained. Secondly, there was a sophisticated market in Egypt. They were trading in equities, a lot of talent, a lot of experience. We had been investing in our day job in marketable shares in Egypt for some time. That's quite a bit different than the European enterprise funds. The third, clearly, was there was violence all around. You didn't have that much violence in Europe at the time. And I could go on and on the difference. On my first trip, I realized that this is the first decision I made, maybe the best. Enterprise funds are like a business. It depends on the quality of the people. You have to have yes, Kim is right, the board has to be important, but your CEO is very significant, because I was not going to sit in Cairo and find investments without having devoted my life to it. So I knew I had to do two things. First, one was Egyptianize the enterprise fund. What does that mean? That means the management, the CEO had to be Egyptian, and the board had to be Egyptian as much as we were allowed to. Legislation calls for 3 Egyptians and 6 American citizens. We modified it to 6 Egyptian Americans, or 3 Egyptian Americans and 3 Egyptians and 3 Americans. Actually, just two of us did not speak Arabic. So we just started with the board, and then I went about trying to find who should be the CEO. And that's a long story, which we don't have time to tell, but I think we got fortunate. We found a very capable man who had been trained in New York at Morgan Stanley years ago. He was running a boutique. And then we got lucky again, because when I told him what I thought we could pay him to take on this assignment of finding the investments, he said, I make more than that now. Why would I do that? And then a light went off in my head, and I said, I have an idea. You should form a management company. We'll be your first client. You'll manage our money, or some of our money, and we'll pay you a fee. So when the enterprise fund liquidates out, you're going to have a very major asset manager that'll be very successful. And he liked that idea if we helped him do it, and we did do it. And today it is a very successful asset management company, and 5 years from now it'll be a very large factor, because they have the best talent. They have drawn in the best talent, in my opinion, that I've met in Cairo, who are running that now. So that was the first business, and that was our literally early on decision to create employment, because all those people went to work for that. My most important decision, I've said already, was hiring Ashraf Zaki to be the CEO. I talk to him almost every Sunday. As you all know, Sunday's a work day there, so for the first 2 years, we talked all the time. He has built a terrific business, totally trustworthy. If I were allowed to invest in the Egyptian Enterprise Fund, I would do it. I've been saying this over and over again. They should, under the rules right now, I'm not allowed to do it, but I would have done that directly, and that would have demonstrated the commitment that I had personally. Of course, I could not do that. My first surprise, no one wanted to have the U.S. government own a piece of their business. No one wanted to even sell 10 or 20% to, I don't mean to pick on USAID, to any agency of the United States government. So I hadn't realized the extent of the animosity or the fear of that. How do we overcome that? That was a trick. That's why we had to Egyptianize it. But we would have meeting after meeting, and they would, we were buying equity, but because this is a country that needs equity more than debt. As you may know, interest rates there are now, at this time, 18% or so. So equity was extremely important. So we had to overcome that. The first mistake, we wanted to buy a bank. We knew that financial inclusiveness was absolutely critical. No small or middle-sized enterprise without capital can grow, and our task was to grow the economy. If you grow the economy, you're going to create jobs, and that's very important. In most of the countries, as you know, certainly in Egypt, you have maybe a 30% unemployment factor in the youth That's a dangerous factor going forward. You have to solve that problem. You have to find a way to create jobs. So you have to grow that. And I felt by buying a bank, we would be able to make loans to small and middle-sized enterprise companies directly, and I could get my former agency, the U.S. Exim Bank, to enter into a joint venture to provide funding to be on-lent to businesses wanting to buy something in the United States. And I was so confident we'd be successful that we talked to KfW in Germany and a number of other countries to join with the Exim Bank model. So we had a consortium of what could have been 400 or 500 million. And then my big surprise, the governor of the central bank rejected the idea of a U.S. private equity, he used to call it, going forward. So that was a lost year. That's the kind of problem actually Kim refers to and often others. It takes a long time to build a business. So we spent a year trying to do that deal. We couldn't get it done. We then did act quickly. We said, if we're not going to get a bank, we're going to get a consumer finance business. We found the leading consumer finance business called Sarwa, and we bought that. And that has led us to provide very significant number of loans to SMEs and to hire a lot of new people. That's another long story. Our first investment couldn't have been more successful in my judgment. We bought what is the leading electronic payment service company. Most of you probably know, or if you don't, less than 10% of the people in a country like Egypt have a bank account. So if you want to pay your bills, you have to wait in a long line outside the utility to pay your bills. So a PayPal type business, in this case run by a very bright man, could be very successful, and it has been very successful. So today, 25 million Egyptians use the Fowry payment service, and it's on its way to half of the country's population. So if you talk about making a difference, and making a difference quickly, and making a difference on the development side, if half of the country, if 40 or 45 million people are using this pay service, and that means their life, the quality of life is better, not to mention the fact that this company is growing like this and is going to become a publicly traded company in a year or two or three, and we'll get all of our money back. But that is making a very significant difference. I don't think there's time, and I want Bo to have his share of time, so I could only say that so far my experience in Egypt has been challenging, but I think the United States will clearly get back a very significant amount of money, and there will be profits that were shared. How we share it, we haven't yet decided upon, but clearly it indicates to me the future of enterprise funds. But I think in each country, things are a little different, so you have to analyze it. You must be careful. You cannot put Americans on the ground in most of these countries, in my experience. You really have to have it localized in that sense. You need to buy in, and you have to be something of an ambassador yourself. You have to be constantly making friends and building relationships. So a week does not go by where Egyptians are not coming to my office in New York. And I have two very talented Egyptians working in my office here. I would introduce them because they're here in the audience now, but I don't have enough time to do all that. But everybody associated on this business is Egyptians, and they are very capable. And without that capacity, we could never achieve what we're going to do. So I'll
Jim,
stop.
let me just take a minute. Why don't just recognize, if you would, your two colleagues who are here in the audience.
Yes,
Go
first, Emil, where are you now? You should stand up. So I'll tell a brief story about Emil, if I may. We have a very talented Egyptian-American who is very senior partner in a private equity firm in Boston, and he and I were talking about it, and he said, Harvard Business School has 3 or 4 Egyptians graduating every year. You should interview him. I did interview him clearly, and Emil was obviously coming out of the business school, very talented. She had worked as the Minister of Finance in Egypt, so she knew the government, and she knew the U.S., and having come out of Harvard, it was a no-brainer. So for 3 years, more people will say, hey, I couldn't have gotten anything. I could really have not gotten anything significantly done without her help. So if she leaves me, I'm leaving too. Unfortunately, she just got married. She just got married to her Egyptian fiance, and they were gone for 2 or 3 weeks on a honeymoon. And I I had to go back to doing everything all over again, which made it extremely happy. And Yasmin is there if you want to stand up for a moment. Yasmin. And she has come in only 3 or 4 months ago, but also very capable. This is what I mean by the human talent in Egypt is I could build an investment bank around her. Next to her is Yara, who was an intern with us also from Egypt. So we have had very good experience. I could go on, but there's others who want to talk.
Thanks. Thanks a lot, Jim. But Bo, thanks for being here. You're the chair of the Tunisian American Enterprise Fund. So how did you got a phone call to do this? Who called you, and why did you say yes to taking on the challenge of running the Tunisian American Enterprise Fund?
Same two people. And I had known Tommy Nides forever, and Mike Froman had worked for me in the earlier part of the Clinton years, so that I knew and trusted both of them. And it wasn't a terribly hard decision. I had spent a fair part of my life dealing in a combination of both development and finance. The finance part in the private sector, the development part in a whole variety, wearing a variety of hats. And so the possibility of combining these in the kind of environment, in the kind of context that an enterprise fund meant was a very, very attractive challenge. So it to me wasn't it wasn't much of a struggle.
Okay. So tell me about what your experience has been to date. Did you have the same kind of challenges that Jim had, or did you have different sets of challenges? What was it like standing up the fund, and what's the makeup of your board, and what are the kinds of investments you've been making?
Starting it up, investments in deals, or board investments in deals. All right. Our context is completely different than Egypt, and Jim has had in an immediate sense a much harder problem. Tunisia, as opposed to Egypt at the time, is predominantly favorably inclined to the United States, regards the United States as important. So I never have faced any of the kinds of difficulties that Jim faced, and I admire what Jim has had to do in the course of getting through that. Mine is a little bit different. Is that Tunisia? This was right after a revolution, in which the dictator had been a kleptocrat for a generation. So that the structure of the Tunisian economy was exactly what you would expect, is that there was vast crony capitalism. There was a World Bank report about the time that I took on the role about the amount of money that the departed dictator who had been run out of the country had taken from the Tunisian economy. There was crony capitalism was kind of was an expected event, but one of the things you find, it was a learning experience for me, is that one of the things you find is the tentacles of that extend everywhere, and they affect vastly the whole regulatory system, and they affect the structure of the economy. So Tunisia was, while much more a friendly environment, was also at the same time a much less developed economy in the sense of Egypt. The other kind of difficulty of Tunisia is that it is, as a friend of mine said, and I hope I won't offend anybody in the audience, he said that one of the things you're going to discover is the dead hand of French bureaucracy. And it functions under the Napoleonic Code. So as opposed to the U.S., where the basic underlying rule is if it doesn't say you can't do it, then you can try to figure out how to do it. Under French law and Tunisian regulatory law, if it doesn't say you can do it, you can't do it. So we had real problems in the setup. We have set ourselves up as a non-bank financial business. We meet all of the Tunisian regulatory requirements. But getting to that point And if you really looked at the details of our structure, you would find some fairly squirrely elements. And the reason for that is with the quiet assistance of Tunisian regulatory authorities and Tunisian ministers of finance, and the, I think, enormous sort of creativity of our board and the absolutely phenomenal person that I found to be our chief operating officer, we found a way around all the rules. But no one else in Tunisia ever has. We're the only person we are the only institution that exists in Tunisia that can invest the way we do, which is kind of across the full gamut of debt and equity. And there is a point there to underline, which is that these are akin to startups in every conceivable respect, except that you don't have to raise the basic money. Having been involved in lots of startups in which I was the investor, actually the raising of the money is not the hard part of the startup. It's sort of figuring out what the business is and setting up a structure and finding the people, all of which we do. And there were two complications that hit me constantly. One is that one way in which the world is different now than it was way back is that we have to meet every single one of the new U.S. financial regulations. So we are hit by Dodd-Frank, and we're hit hard by by legislation like that. And when you begin to talk to those authorities, they've never heard of enterprise funds, and they've never heard of AID, or that we're a financial entity and we have to meet those rules. Similarly, in Tunisia, we're not some favored entity. We have to meet all of the regulatory structures of Tunisia or we cannot function. So the time it took an immense amount of time to figure out kind of what it was that we could do, and then learn that most of what we wanted to do we couldn't do, and then figure out how you would do it despite that fact. And it took 1.5 years to do that. There's an issue there, and one of the things that I was going to talk to, and I'll just mention one of them now, is what are some of the problems, is that doing these things requires immense patience on the part of the U.S. government. I had the enormous good fortune, Jim and I did, in dealing with AID to deal with an organization that had the patience. The person with whom we did most of our negotiating, Bill Baldridge, is right in front of us. PAIGE was one of the others. But I have to say that in general, patience is not a recognized virtue of the United States government. And so as soon as your two close friends who invited you to do this leave, there is no one in the U.S. government who ever heard of you or ever cares about you for 1 second. And so you are the one who's doing the integrating. You're the one who has to go and talk to the White House. Oh, but by the way, there's no one in the White House left who ever remembered even setting this thing up.
Sorry, Bo Cutter, who's that?
That's exactly right. An enterprise fund, what's that? So I would not use this mechanism, and I loved this mechanism, and being asked to do it is a gift, and I have found it to be just a tremendously important to me, in addition to what I hope we accomplish. But I would not do this if we did not, as a wider purpose, if you did not figure out a way to have the U.S. government see these as somehow something different than a one-off beyond AID. And that's kind of one. You said, what do we do? We've set up as a non-bank financial business. There aren't the financial institutions to buy in or to invest into in Tunisia. I started with the same view. I was going to buy a bank. I discovered that the bank was bankrupt, that the Tunisian government nevertheless wanted to be paid a substantial amount for this bank, and that we were going to have to fire a large number of people. That struck me as a threefer, that 3 bad reasons to do a deal, so we didn't do the deal. And we'll eventually, so what we've done is set up a non-bank financial business, and we invest across the whole spectrum of the small and medium enterprise sector. So our investments are each one of them is quite small. They sum probably to about the same amount that Jim has invested. And we're expecting a quite decent rate of return. For if you're interested in the numbers, we underwrite our deals to about a 15% internal rate of return. After you take out costs and the fact that we're going to have some deals that break, we're looking at somewhere between an 8 to 10% rate of return on our ongoing activities. And I'm assuming we'll get lucky, and that our rates of return will, in the end, will be somewhat better than that. I actually think we'll make our real money and have the real development effect by backing into owning a financial institution, either because the institution that we've set up in much the same way that Jim did is itself going to be a leading financial institution in Tunisia, or because, it is, as is beginning to happen, a couple of the places that we've co-invested need more funds are going to have our equity. So that's kind of what we've done. The basic how we've done it, and our board is, we meet the U.S. rules that it's 6 American citizens and 3 Tunisian, but there are a few crossovers in that. And if I could be a little bit more flexible on that, I would. Every single one of my board members is a working professional in the financial field. 4 of them are chief executive officers in something. I know how good Jim's board is. I'll stack our board up against anybody. There is nobody in the financial world who has a board any better than ours. And we know this field. It's a little hard to get people who are CEOs in their fields to come and do something for nothing. But it is a real working board. The point that Jim made that that in his case he had to Egyptianize it holds for me too, is that with the exception of me and Louise Stoner Crawford, who is right there and who has helped me, who has been more than critical in doing all of the unbelievable amount of work that you actually have to do here in the United States to get one of these things, to keep one of these things going. Everybody else in the TAF, the Tunisian American Enterprise Fund, is Tunisian. Our chief operating officer is a woman named Hala Faradi, who is absolutely phenomenal, and who has been the life spirit behind this work. And I have a similar nightmare as Jim did. That kind of every night I just hope to God that something didn't happen that gets Hala to think that what she really ought to do is go cash in and kind of earn 4 times as much somewhere else. But at the moment, she seems dedicated to the work. I'll make 1 or 2 more points. Jim made a point about equity, and I want to make a point that our money, I think this goes for Jim, but I know it goes for me, is actually considerably more than the amount. And I in theory have $100 million. It comes in tranches. It's another aspect of a problem that I would solve, is that the whole rest of the U.S. government, because of the fact that there is no kind of real level of patience, regards that money as money to be taken away. They've done it once. They're trying to do it again. So no one can comfortably say they have X amount of money, because that's what, in fact, has been committed to it. You don't have it till you get it. And it's a view that I would express strongly to the Congress, and I already have. But let's assume I have $100 million. That's 1/3 of 1% of the, if I use, rather than purchasing price parity, I use exchange value GDP of the Tunisian GDP. And you'd think that, Jesus, that can't be how can you have much of an effect if your total value is 1/3 of 1%? Well, in the following way. First of all, these countries are critically investment scarce. My basic numbers are that for a country like Tunisia to have a decent growth rate, it needs to invest somewhere around 25% of GDP. My guess is it's somewhere around 12 to 14% right now. So it's got about a 10 percentage point gap. The Tunisian government is currently investing approximately 0 because most of its money is spent on salaries and subsidies. and funding the deficit. So there's virtually no public sector investment, and if you look at the private sector investment, my judgment is that almost all of it comes from the big family companies, so that almost nothing goes into the SME sector. So I represent, with my paltry $100 million, basically all the equity capital there is
In the country.
in the country for what we want to invest in. And I want to invest in the core of the small and medium enterprise sector, because I fundamentally believe that there's not a country on earth that doesn't fundamentally depend for its growth rate and its employment on a healthy SME sector. So we're all the equity. And in that respect, you can magnify a little bit. And the second is that because no one really, the second point about that is because no one really focuses on the SME sector. I'd say, as a general rule, that that small businessmen get royally screwed by every country on earth. There is no country that cares, that every country says how much it cares about the small and medium enterprise sector. No country actually does much about it. Almost all of the small and medium enterprise banks, public banks in the world, are bankrupt. So if one of the things we can do is show that a vibrant SME sector matters to growth and development, and at the same time show that you can actually make money with sensible investments in it, we can, by that alone, have a substantial effect.
Great. Okay. So I want to start with Kim, and I want to go down the row here. I want you to each talk about if you were going to create an enterprise fund 2.0. So, for example, the U.S. Congress has some legislation now that's talking about establishing one for Jordan, which I think is great. Let's assume that there are a dozen countries or 24 countries where this could work in some way, shape, or form. What kind of adjustments, based on this conversation and from the lessons that you've learned, what would you say if you were going to create an enterprise fund 2.0? Kim, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, I think I'm much less qualified to answer that question than Jim and Bo, because I think their experience is obviously much more recent. For me, I do think that there has to be some better mechanism for USAID, and that should, I think it should still stay at USAID, the relationship with the funds. When our funds were set up in the original SEED Act, basically the White House appointed a board, and then it was sort of self-perpetuating. The board, I think, had approval rights, but really never exercised them sort of as people came up. And I think there were times where there was a lot of frustration at USAID with the relationship with the board. So I would probably spend a little bit more time. You know, it's great when you have a board as you know, Jim has and Bo has, and I think our board was, you know, equally very strong. There has to be some more formal ongoing mechanism for the relationship between the enterprise fund and USAID. But to be clear, what you cannot do is have USAID micromanagement at any level with respect to deal approval. And you have to keep a clear sense that although we're on the same team, essentially because it's USG funds, we are different teams, and we're doing different things with different timelines. So that would be my one overriding comment is more formality with respect to the USAID board relationship, but no more, but nothing beyond that in terms of involvement.
Okay, great.
Maybe just a couple of reasons why we should be considering something like this. I always tell the story about in my last year at Exim Bank, the Chinese came to see me and wanted to second some people to Exim Bank. And I thought they might want one or two people, but they said, no, 55 people. They were going to second 55 people. Exim Bank's only 450 people. But I didn't know then is that China had its export credit agency, its Exim Bank, was providing funding for something like $2 or $3 billion a year. Exim, the United States, was doing about 15, 18 billion at that time. Today, the Chinese have 3 export credit agencies and provide more funding for their private sector exports than all the other 83 export credit agencies in the world by 3. They do more than 500 billion. It's a staggering amount. Now, why did I tell you the story? China's hasn't figured out yet that they are a sort of variation of an enterprise fund. They're encouraging their own private sector to go out and make investments and so forth. But if there's anything that would convince the members of Congress is to just take a look at China's heading towards a giant enterprise fund for all of the developing world. They might do it slightly different. And that's one factor. And the other factor is something which I give Dan and the credit to CSIS for observing the growth of the development finance agencies in the last 10, 12 years has been very great, sevenfold in their level of activity. They far surpass today foreign assistance programs, and that's where we are heading the next 5 years. Very significant growth if supporting investment in the private sector. Now, an enterprise fund, in my judgment, is, I haven't discussed this with others, but is a variation of a development finance institution. Both are transaction focused. Both want to invest money, either small businesses or large. Both support the private sector. And both, frankly, make the same impact on job creation and economic growth. So if any of us were looking at what could the United States do to help economic development? Let's face it, if you have unemployment at the kind of rate we have in some of these countries, and we have the kind of violence we have all over, we have got to work on economic development and create jobs. So if we were focused on that, we would conclude that enterprise funds in its current structure, there could be, Dan alludes to, there could be modifications made, there could be improvements made, but the concept of supporting private sector growth, that is what's important. The IMF is responsible for stability, and they came into Egypt and they've created stability in Egypt now. But they cannot, in my judgment, I haven't seen any evidence, help create economic growth in Egypt. Economic growth comes from private sector development. Private sector development will come from something like enterprise funds multiplied to a much larger extent. The other comment is that you don't need as much money. I wouldn't want to make this statement too many times publicly to my friends on the Hill, but once the U.S. puts in an amount of money, with the private sector looking to make investments now in a country like Egypt, it would be different in Tunisia, clearly, and it was different during Kim's day. But today, private equity firms all over the United States are looking to make investments. And we took in our first deal because we wanted to prove to Egypt that we could bring in other investors. That was part of our mission. So when we bought Fowry, it was a $100 million transaction. We put up $20 million. We took in 2 private equity firms for $80 million. They had never invested in Egypt before. So we could be, all enterprise funds could be, at when you get to an Egypt size, could be a catalyst for a lot of private sector. If I were asked in the next X number of years, the $300 million that we have now in the enterprise fund in Egypt will be $1 billion. Part of it will be coming from the profits we've enjoyed, but most of it will come from us bringing in other investors to join us on investments we made. So it will be $1 billion that we will end up investing in Egypt, maybe larger. The message in that is that the U.S. doesn't have to put up that much money. If the U.S. puts its, quote, name and support, people will want to be involved. And so it can be done with U.S. support. So I think the argument to Congress, you don't have to budget that much. And the U.S., just like the development finance institutions, will get all of its money back. All of the money comes back, and we achieve a goal of helping the private sector to grow and help development. We have counted as best we're able to 500 jobs, let's say. It's going to be a much larger number because of the expansion of the activities we have. We have a little easier task because it's obviously a larger country, and we have obviously a lot more private sectors to invest in. But I think that my conclusion is clearly that the enterprise fund is a very good concept. We have to figure a way to do what we're doing today, tell the story, so the U.S. government can think about it. I happen to be cautiously optimistic about what I'm about to say because it has a comment about this administration. This administration, for whatever critical comment you have, and I have plenty, however, does respect the private sector. And the private sector is the key. We have in the United States the greatest private sector ever created mankind by far. And that's why we ended up with the kind of economy that we have right now. So to take the talent we have in our private sector and match them up with a limited amount of funds to go into various countries to help develop their private sector is doable. Maybe it'll take a focus of a particular group in the government, but this administration might understand it. That would be my conclusion, Dan.
Thanks. Okay, Bo?
I'll talk briefly to three topics. The first is to agree emphatically with what Jim just said, but add a little piece to it. The second is to talk about the context that future efforts like this should be set in. And the third is to talk to what seemed to me to be the critical elements. First, I can't improve on Jim's thoughts about the way in which the world is turning and why these matter. But I had some hesitation about using these numbers because they do say a little bit about how old I am, but that's probably apparent anyway, so I won't. I'll do it anyway. I was leaving a confirmed role in the Carter administration when Jimmy Carter asked me, this is toward the end of the presidency, to kind of take a look at international flows and to talk to him a little bit about development. And thinking back now, about 40 years later, at that time, approximately 80% of the international flows to the developing world, and this may be true for the whole world, were official flows.
ODA, foreign aid.
And ODA and other official flows, and about 20% were pure private sector. In other words, the entire international financial markets grew up in the 80s and 90s. And those of us, all of us, it's kind of like speaking prose all your life and not knowing it, is that we all together grew up in that era. And now it's flipped. And something like 90% of all of the flows in the world are commercial, and 10% are official flows, ODA flows. And that says that the nature of the world in which you have to carry out development has fundamentally changed. And I'm not so certain that a kind of deep gut realization of that has sunk in all of the development institutions around the world or in the U.S. But what it really means is, and I think part of this is, like all of it is, but is extremely healthy, which is that the way growth is going to happen, and a world of chaos exists or happens if growth doesn't happen, and if it's not an inclusive and equitable form of growth, which is, by the way, a reason I want to focus on small and medium enterprise. But it has to be through a healthy development of the private sectors. And that means that governments, and the only government I really care about is the one we're in, is this one, has to think about what are the tools that let us foster development that way. This is not an ideological opposition to kind of old-fashioned development. I was a member of the CARE board for 19 years, and I was its chair for 8. So I think about and care about that kind of development. But to be absolutely honest, that kind of development is, in the weight of things, is diminishing. And what we're doing here is increasing. So we have to have institutions that deal with and know how to deal with private sectors all over the world, and those are inherently going to be kind of financial. I could extend that, I'll just note the points to say that What that means is that often equity is incredibly important. One of the many groups, I feel sometimes like a Vietnamese peasant, that I'm out there hoeing the field and a battle gets fought over me, and I hoe the other field and the battle gets fought over me. And this is true of all of the varying devices that have been existed to evaluate Jim and me. But in one of them, a team that came were listened in rapt attention as I explained something completely new to them, which was that there was a difference between debt and equity, and that difference mattered.
Yes.
This was in a group that came to evaluate me. So if I sometimes have a little bit of a chip on my shoulder about all of this, you'll understand it. All right, so what Jim basically said was right, and that the way the world has turned makes what Jim said essential. Point two, it really does matter. Just as I ran OMB a long, long time ago, and you come out of that thinking that no one else in the entire U.S. government cares much about budgets, and that no one certainly cares anything about management. And it does matter that the M part of that really matters. And if you're going to expand this tool, you have to think in terms of where you're going to, what's the setting for it. And I don't mean the place. I think disaster awaits if you don't keep it at AID. And part of that is because I've been quite happy with the nature of the relationship. But I think it's set up to do this. But just to underline some points. One, as I've already said, a level of patience is required by the entire government that is simply not natural to the U.S. government. The second is that these kinds of things are inherently outsiders. Think about it, that you create this pot of money and you provide it then to this outside person that some few people in the U.S. government know, but not everybody, and those people leave and then nobody knows them. It's not really a program that's owned by anybody. And so in the end, it's kind of the redheaded stepchild. So you spend a great deal of your life trying to integrate the U.S. government, but more than that, trying to keep saying, no, actually we are running something that's a program that you guys approved. And something about the outsider status of it has to be altered. And the final point, I already made this, is the money. Particularly if you look at what's happened to budgets and you look into what's happened to discretionary budgets looking out over the next 5 years, any amount of money set out there that isn't hard committed is going to be ripped off by somebody else. So if you want them to have the money, then you got to figure out a way to let them have the money. And so patience, the outsider status, and the money. Now finally is the elements. They all are going to differ. Jim's focus and mine have very similar, have lots of parallels, but the specifics are quite different. And they're different a little bit because Jim and I are different, but they're also different because the contexts are really different. This has been true of all of them. And so you have to allow for that. And as you alter the circumstances of where you put them, if you try to put them in really, really difficult places, by that I mean vastly more difficult than Tunisia or Egypt or Jordan, which would be a wonderful place to start. I mean, I know Jordan pretty well. I think it'd be a great place to have a fund. I think one is actually authorized for Jordan. It's the actual creation of one that's the issue. But there are more difficult places than that, and there are more difficult problems you could set them to. Here are the elements. There has to be a recognition that you're basically going to be using outsiders, because if you're really going to focus on the real problems and issues, which is how do private sectors work, that's not what governments know. The second is that you're going to have to accord those outsiders a very considerable amount of independence. I mean, when you start, I wouldn't have done this work if in the end we hadn't been given this independence. But if you step back and think about it, it is remarkable how much independence we actually have. But it's necessary. It is absolutely essential. I mean, every single decision that I've made is one that could have legitimately been contested by 44 other people and taken me a year or years to get done. And I don't mean to personalize it. It's the board, it's my board, and it's HALA. But these are not easy decisions. So, I'm quite willing to bear the brunt. We are willing to be accountable for what results. But you got to let us, if you're going to hold us accountable, you got to give us the responsibility and the right to make the decisions. And finally, to come back to a dull subject, the money has to actually be committed. Every single time that doesn't happen for me, I'm the one who has to take the rounds and explain to all the people who work for me, all the businesses who all know, since there are no secrets on earth, know this instantly, and everybody in the affected government, why this doesn't really mean that they're pulling out the rug on for us, that it's sort of an unfortunate result. So that's committed money, you have to deal with outsiders, and you have to understand that you're going to provide them with a fair amount of independence.
Great. Jim, can I ask you to turn off your microphones?
Me or Jim?
Yeah, thanks. Okay. Paige, so what's your take on this?
First, old habits die hard. Just to correct one thing that Bo said, the group that came to talk to him about and didn't know the difference between debt and equity was not from USAID.
Oh, I didn't imply that.
I know.
I didn't mean to imply that.
And so we had helpful congressional staffers who want to put things in regular order to make sure enterprise funds actually exist. They might have had a bit of a...
I'm sorry, I really should have said it. It absolutely was not AID.
Sorry, old habits die hard. So I would say to follow on what Kim said, the formality in the relationship is important. I think USAID, state, the White House, and these enterprise funds have to understand where there's oversight, where there's micromanagement, making sure there is appropriate levels of oversight without micromanagement. That goes to both Jim and Bo's point about the outsider status. I think it's incredibly important to have something like a private board that actually can make these decisions without having to get things checked off by the U.S. government. And the U.S. government also has a hands-off relationship in that way, so if an investment is made and it goes south, it's not on the U.S. government. So I think both those things are important. I would say the public-private nature of this, and to Bo and Jim's point about the private sector being such a large part of how assistance is done now, I think it's really important to look at the other development programs that have run with the Gates Foundation and with the Rockefeller Foundation, where AID and state have partnered, a number of other agencies within the U.S. government have partnered to leverage each other's money to make these more effective development programs. The private sector is a perfect place that this could be done. I mean, I work now, and Heineken does a lot of our funding with the Dutch government because it increases both their ability to locally source raw materials and the development goals of trying to get African growers to grow the things that they can sell, not just sell what they're growing. So these things truly leverage each other, and it can be done in the private equity and the private sector capacity in a way that Enterprise Fund 2.0 could be much more effective if it weren't just the U.S. government going it alone. So I would say that that would probably be the best. And then lastly, post-liquidation plans. It would be really nice if once this is legally determined how an enterprise fund would look, the liquidation plans for when that ends, which is past all of our times, will not be leaving other people holding the bag, especially $150 million that's still sitting in Congress to liquidate the Russia fund, for example, which is money that could be used, and it's just a political football since the first CN in 2008 and then 2011.
So it's been sitting for 10 years?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yep.
That's really stupid.
Yeah, so it's $150 million, which could be put to good use somewhere, somehow, some way. And it's just can't be determined. So those post-liquidation plans have to be determined in advance before you start something, because I think you two, again, this will be well past all of our time in 2027, but we're going to leave this bag with someone else to clean up, and it's that should be legislated appropriately.
Great. Okay, you've all been really patient. There's a lot of smart people in this audience. So I want to see a show of hands. I want to call on some, otherwise I'm happy to call on some folks who I know a lot about this. So I see David Coles is here. I see my friend Michael Levitt is here.
Jim Holmes.
Yep, good, okay. So let's start, let's get David and Michael to start first, and then we'll get some other folks here. Yep, and then I'll get to you too. We'll get a lot of folks.
Hi, David Coles with AID. I'd like to hear a little bit more on the boards, particularly from Bo Cutter and Jim Harmon, how you balance the dual mandate and the development impact versus the financial returns. How do you incentivize your staff to be looking hard at the development impact? And when you bring co-funders on board, is it difficult to sometimes explain to them that you're not only out about maximizing returns, but you also have a social or a development impact you're looking at as well?
Okay, we're going to do this World Bank style, so we're going to bunch them all together. So I want to hear from Michael Levitt, and then I want to hear from Jim Holmes.
Hi, Michael Levitt. Some of this story actually comes from money from Colson. So years ago, I was involved with supplying a large number of experts that do due diligence for a large number of enterprise funds. So for me, it's what was the difference between them as part of the lessons learned. And the conflict between development and return was overwhelming in some of them, where it was just totally confused. And I would point out, none of you gave a report on development. You all talked about return, which is fine, but this is my tax dollars. I want development. I realize that jobs are important, but there's more to it. So one of this is, if there's lessons learned, one of them is it clear? And if it's not development, if it's development, how are you going to measure that? So that's one thing. Second, staff. Between the funds, the staff disparity in quality was unbelievable. Unbelievable. And that isn't just where they were bad. Third, the CEOs. Some of them thought they were Wall Street investors, and some of them thought they were Main Street investors. That would be great if they knew which countries they had been assigned to. So I'm a big fan of the enterprise funds, but it seems to me one of the ways of looking at lessons learned is look at those 17, not just the 4 that failed, and why were some of them really good. And I'm sorry, just one more thing. The easiest story, shortest story, we were asked to supply an expert on for a big investment. We took a CEO from that industry, stayed 3 weeks, came back to the big meeting and said, they don't need your money. I thought that we costed out the production lines and we can save them $2-3 million a month, not a problem. We were never called back by that fund because we thought we were there for development and they wanted the good deal.
Okay, Jim Holmes. Yeah.
Whoops.
Well,
There you go.
I'm not Jim Holmes, but my name's Don. Okay, great. My name's Don DeAmesis, and I was a former general counsel at OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. And I have one comment. One comment is debt and equity is in the eye of the beholder often, and so that comment on is it debt or is it equity, I know at OPIC we went often to legally defensible extremes to make a debt instrument into a equity-like instrument. Second point, in terms of the development impact, I know that one of the big issues that was confronted at OPIC and at the International Finance Corporation involves the intermediary financial institutions and the ESG standards, environmental social governance standards, and curious how as in some ways intermediaries here between the U.S. government and down to the SMEs, how you deal with that issue. And then a third point, I suppose, is generally within the U.S. government, I think of the enterprise funds as oftentimes bespoke types of institutions that come up from time to time, responsive to the foreign policy objectives, mostly of the United States, combined with development, and how there might be a more systematic approach with either enterprise funds or combining it with the whole that sort of development finance strategy for the United States.
Okay, will the real Jim Holmes stand up, please? There you go.
Yeah, if you want to handle those first three and then come back to me, that's fine. I apologize. I'd like to make a comment or two rather than a question. Jim Holmes, I was the Deputy Director for Policy Planning at the time that the enterprise funds were set up, had a very large role in the establishment of it, and then I was 3 years as C coordinator. Point one, enterprise funds were never set up as a political tool. They were set up as a policy tool. And a reflection of that is my memory that the first submission from the White House with respect to the establishment of a funding was for a proposal that was called 1,000 Points of Light Fund. And USAID and State Department pushed back on that and said this is not reflective of the policy approach. This was reflective of the political agenda of the White House. They yielded. And they yielded at that time because there was a cadre of people who were focused upon private sector as a value and a value which could be exported to Eastern Europe. And therefore, the enterprise funds were set up to train, to educate, and to develop. The first item on the box was not whole grain. The first item on the box was not make money. The first item on the box was to train, to educate, and to develop. No one expected, frankly, that there was going to be a return, and if there was to be a return, we negotiated, okay, well, then we'll deal with that then, but it's not going to be very great. Point two, I think both you, Daniel, and Kim understated the importance of the boards. The best example is the Czech fund, which was totally dysfunctional. I had to go to board meetings in order to keep sides apart, in order to take a message from one part of the board to the chairman. It was a blessing when that thing was folded up and put to bed. So I commiserate with Kim with respect to picking up the pieces, but there was nothing, there was no second due, no mulligan as far as Czech fund is concerned. It failed. End of point. And thirdly, lastly, no blueprints. The enterprise funds were set up without any expectation, without any requirements as far as the board is concerned. USAID, State Department, White House said, okay, these are the people in whom we have registered faith and confidence for you to do the job, and there was minimum oversight. And I tell you, there was minimum oversight from the Congress as well. Sonny Callahan, I used to go up to the Hill and talk to Sonny Callahan on numerous occasions just to make sure that he felt plugged in to what was going on there. But they really did not ride herd on the enterprise funds. So when you got to the point where the Polish enterprise fund was ready to do something else besides make money, there was no blueprint for doing it, and it required a considerable, actually about 3 years of negotiation in order to come up with a solution which ultimately divided the thing up in a roughly 50-50%.
Great, okay. So let's hear from Kim. I'm going to have you start, and we'll just go down and just get folks to react to the topics and questions that are put on the table.
Okay, first I have to thank Jim, who was my interlocutor when I had that job for 6 months, and also was our ambassador to Estonia, and when we worked together for 3 years. And David, who is currently our liaison with the Baltic Fund. I want to go to the question of development. I think there's a false premise, which is that there is a difference between sort of profit and development. I'm often reminded of the comment that Bill Gates may have done more for the world by inventing Microsoft's system than he ever did or will do with the Gates Foundation. And so I just completely reject the notion that there is this eternal conflict. I would argue that, in fact, having clear discipline around profit was what allowed us to train 200 to 300 people in how capitalism works, which perhaps is our greatest legacy. And that it also provided a sense of discipline within the organization. And moreover, that 20,000 mortgages, 20,000 homeowners, leveraging $50 million into $800 million of financing has huge development impact. And I think that there is sort of this desperate desire to have boxes, development boxes and profit boxes, and I don't think the world divides itself that clearly. I'm completely confident that if a fund is run well, that you can achieve both goals. Now, I do think that as I said, we focused on the credit markets because we had very, very immature equity markets, and we were focused on preservation of capital and modest returns. So, you know, I can be accused of ambiguity, but that was the ambiguity we chose to live in as a way of balancing sort of profit and development, and I'm comfortable with that decision, and I'm comfortable with the results.
I'm actually going to jump in because the only question I want to address is Michael's about the development. I agree with what Kim's saying. I also think you need to look at the fact that $1.3 billion has been left behind to fund 9 different legacy foundations in these countries. And that is truly where we're seeing the development impact at this point. I appreciate, as Jim said, that this was initially set up to train, educate, and develop. But I think the private sector link and development was crucial at that time, and it remains crucial in the Middle East funds as well. There is a development component to it, just like there is a democracy component, and it is not all just private sector. For the purpose of private sector, a booming private sector happens when FDI can come in because there's rule of law and there are democratic principles that exist. So I think that actually the language has been tweaked to allow for development impact, although it looks like a private sector one. Oh, well, I said.
I'll quarrel with that,
well,
too.
Yeah, and
Confrontationalist.
yeah, no, and I started by saying everyone determined a different development impact. So.
My first comment about our strategic objectives was training our staff.
I do want to start by agreeing with Kim on what he said about the confusion between development. I mean, if you have growing businesses, there's no better illustration than the first investment we made, which I talked about, which is in the payment service business. The fact that 25 million Egyptians now are able to pay their bills without waiting online 3 or 4 hours, that they can borrow a little bit of money, that they can communicate, this changed the quality of life of a lot of Egyptians. So to me, that's development. Now, it happens we'll make money on it, so it's both, but I don't think you exclude one from the other. Having said that, I myself now have begun in the last, let's say, year to focus a little bit more on development than I did at the beginning because I see the profits that we're going to have. So we're going to return very significant profits. So what does that mean? If we can get a return of 2 or 3%, no other private equity investor would take that. We will do it if it's something good. Now, my favorite subject is one my staff has heard me say 100 times. It's because I'm involved with a think tank dealing with environment and sustainability. I'm determined to find a way to help modify the traffic problem in Cairo. Now, that would change the quality of life of everybody. And the World Bank did a study in 2010. They found that it cost the Egyptian economy $8 billion a year, about 4% of the then economy, to have this problem. So this morning, out of curiosity, I tracked down the person who did some work on it at the World Bank. I said, what is it today? He said, today, $20 billion. $20 billion of the Egyptian economy is impacted because the traffic problem has got to be so great. So we have a way to solve that because it happens that this institution called the World Resources Institute, working with the World Bank, we work on this in a number of cities. And so someday we're going to find a way. That's true development. That would improve the quality of life, reduce the number of accidents. People would get to work on time, and it can be done. So what have I done? I've pushing my staff constantly to find the right person who really focuses on this in Egypt, who's not interested in returns, but interested in not losing money, but interested in doing well. So I think it takes a little bit of push from the top, but we're going to get there. But you have to focus on it. You can't just say growing businesses are going to get you there. So I think it's a very important question. We talk about this subject all the time. Because most times, if you're coming, my background as an investment banker or from Exim, we don't necessarily think about development that way. But we have a chance now, with the profits we're making, to shift now a little bit and to focus on development, which could be very good. Our last acquisition was in the healthcare area. And this is another very significant area, of course, in the developing world, and where we can make a difference. I don't want to spend too much time on the subject, but I'm glad the question was raised.
Other comments or reactions to some of the questions that are put on the table? Bo, do you want to say anything?
I don't want to come off too much in what my wife and some of my staffs accuse me of being as too much of a confrontationalist. But I just fundamentally disagree with the way you asked the question. And I relate myself totally to the conversation, the points that have already been made. But I'll come at it from the other questions you've asked. I don't know what the earlier enterprise funds did. In the course of taking this on, I talked to most of the chairs. I know what Jim has done, and I know that for us, the quality of the board and how the board interacts and governance in the board has been an obsession, and the quality of our staff, how we choose them, how we evaluate them after they've been chosen, how we help them build their own lives, because these are not people who see themselves as aid workers. Our people are people who regard themselves as Tunisian professionals who chose to do this. And so that it's important for us to invest in their futures as well as the deals. So for us, it really has been an obsession. And I don't know the degree to which it's varied in other places, but the chairs that I knew have all said to me that you live or die by the value of your board and the quality of your people. Having now been a professional and having managed staffs for somewhere in the neighborhood of 45 years, I learned a long time ago, you live or die by the quality of the people you work with and by the quality of the boards you choose. I don't know if that's a terribly good answer, but it's the way I approach this. But much more importantly is this question of development. I'm not where Jim is yet. I mean, we're going to do fine in terms of the quality of the deals. Tunisia doesn't offer yet the opportunity for the sort of big hit. So we'll have a very large number of small hits, and our returns over the long run will be very good. So I'm not yet at the point where I can solve the Tunis traffic problems. I wish I could, and I wish Jim good luck at doing that. But I don't really see a conflict. And where I really disagreed completely, sir, with what you said, was the sense that people up here didn't talk about development. I thought the 3-4 of us, actually, that was at the center of what we said. From my point of view, if you do not have a well-functioning small and medium enterprise sector that produces equitable growth, you do not have development. You do not have anything close to development. I have lived with this problem for God knows how many years. As I said, I was on the board of CARE for close to 20 years, and I chaired it for almost half that period of time. The development organizations around the world play what I think are these stupid games between there's some set of metrics that you have, and then there's sort of the whole rest of the world called the economy. And no matter what happens in the economy can go to hell as long as you meet your metrics. I just don't believe that. I think that if we make a significant success in the creation of equitable growth, sustainable equitable growth through a healthy small and medium enterprise sector, we have done an enormous amount for the development of Tunisia and the other countries in which we're involved in. And as an answer to the leverage of additional capital, we underwrite our deals at a particular rate of return, and we then manage them, and we talk to our investees with respect to that, all of whom are entrepreneurs with respect to their own businesses. And as we now can begin to talk to outsiders, to outside money, it's that we offer. we're not saying to them, make some sort of compromise between kind of the rate of return you want and the rate of return we want, and somehow or another that'll work out. It's, here's the rate of return that is available. Tunisia's at a different place. It's not a place where there's going to be oceans of pure private equity begin to flow in. But what we can do is provide an example, and I think we're beginning to do that, that shows that it is beginning to be possible for kind of real private money to make a sufficient return to come to the place.
Okay. But let me just push a little bit on this issue. Are you optimistic about the future of Tunisia? I mean, I think this is, if you said to me, this is a country that's a democracy, it's a multi-party democracy in the Arab world. I mean, if you said to me, like, what I would really hope, you know, for a country in the Arab world to go the right way, I really hope it's Tunisia. I certainly hope the other ones do too, but boy, it would be so great if that country were to continue to have a successful multi-party democracy. Are you optimistic about the future of Tunisia?
I am. Tunisia is fragile, and you can't talk to anybody there who won't tell you that. I mean, one of the things I do every time I go, and I'm going tonight, is I actually have held for me a dinner party that includes all of the heads of almost all of the political parties. It's a fragile place, and the degree to it, the kinds of negotiations that go on to make progress in a country like Tunisia are excruciatingly difficult. It's okay to sit kind of outside a country like that and say they ought to do this and they should have did this. I would remind you that we have some difficulties here in the United States coming to kind of consensus on what are important public policy problems, and they have them there too. But they're making it day by day by day. There aren't going to be any big kind of startling breakthroughs, but it's better now than it was a year ago. And it's a hell of a lot better than it was, say, a year after the revolution, when there were 2 political assassinations within 6 months, one of which occurring when I was there. And you ask Tunisians today, as opposed to, say, 18 months ago, and they will also say it's a lot better than it was before the revolution. They wouldn't have said that 18 months ago, but now they're all beginning to say it. So. Am I optimistic? Yeah. You can't become a part of the country in the way that having the great good fortune to run an enterprise fund or to chair one gives you without becoming deeply attached to the country. I think the leaders of that country have shown immense courage in what they've tried to do, and immense sort of resoluteness in trying to do it. And do I like everything they've done? No, I don't. But it's a tough job.
Okay. All right. I'm cognizant of the time. I want to call on this gentleman. Get this gentleman a microphone.
Thank you. Hi, Jim. My name is Hugh Fierce. I spent 32 years in the Chase Manhattan Bank. And I was on the board of the Baltic American Enterprise Fund and also the Czech Slovak Fund. I'd like to go directly to the question of getting good quality members of the board as well as good quality staff members. Because I spent 32 years in the Chase Manhattan Bank, I can assure you that we had very, very fine training in the array of finance. And because I was retired, I can assure you that there are a number of other retirees who have pensions, who enjoy their pensions, but also look for challenges. And so they are available to you, not only as members of the board, but also as staff members. In the case of Egypt, for example, there are a number of Chase people who worked in Chase National Bank of Egypt, and they retired, and they live in New Jersey, and they talk about what it was like working in Egypt, and they're available. The same thing with Arabic speakers who worked all through the Middle East for the Chase Manhattan Bank and who are available. My friends in the Citibank, Morgan Stanley, are available. And so I just ask you to think about them as potential members of the board as well as potential staff members.
I thank you. I thank you very much for that. I want to make a comment about development finance. We've written a lot over the last 5 years about development finance. I do want to just come back to a comment that was made about the issue about development and finance. I do think there is. I agree, Bo, with your assertion that that development is private sector led development, and that we have to think about the economy and we need growth. I do think, though, that there are different kinds of investors with different kinds of needs, and I think we're seeing a lot of these things like blended finance. And I do think the issue of what taxpayers want, a little bit to some of the comments here, I think there's expectations about how we tell those stories and the kinds of impacts that they have. Now, I think if we're having a growing economy and we can reduce youth unemployment and we can make it attractive for investors, that is development. But I do think there are other metrics as well. And I think IFC, for example, and some of the other bilateral DFIs, OPIC somewhat, but as CDC, for example, or FMO, have spent a lot of time and investment trying to tell a larger story about what they use this funny term, it's kind of a Euro term, additionality. And I think it gets a little bit to my friend and colleague Michael Levitt's comment about where's the development. And I think the question is, where's the additionality? Like, why do we need a Tunisian enterprise fund or an Egyptian enterprise fund or a Baltic American enterprise fund as opposed to, say, a Citibank or an HSBC? And I think that's a little bit one of the questions, I think, and I don't know if there's an answer to it, but I think there's a little bit of a tension in terms of saying why do we have a DFI, or why do we have why we set up a DFI if we don't need it, if quote unquote we don't. I do think we do need them, but I do think there's that I think is some of where the question comes from, or questions like the one that Michael was posing, is that you have different kinds of investors. The whole blended finance or even impact investing movement, I think, comes a little bit at what I think Michael was getting at as well. So I take your point. I agree with you, Bo, that we need full growth in an economy, but I do think there's this interesting tension in these institutions that's not resolvable, but just sits there as a tension about issues of impact and issues of economic growth. I think we want to get both of those.
Well, let me come back
Yes.
to that. I know we don't have a lot of time, but let's first of all talk about blended finance, and then let's second of all talk about the sort of why this kind of instrument and not Citi or HSBC.
Yes.
The first is thanks in important part to some hints and suggestions by AID and otherwise, and in addition to kind of my own reading and my COO Hela's reading, we created what is, I think, one of the only example in the development world I know of a true blended finance for small and medium enterprise, where the nature of the finance in my own view, most of the financial structures devised for small and medium enterprise follow the wrong model. They follow a capital markets model in which they think somehow that's going to get your money back, where 99% of all small businesses are never going to go public. So how do you get your money back? Well, you have to have some blend of a way of equity done in a way in which you can actually get paid back, debt in a way in which the investee can afford to take the debt. Lots of SMEs in most of the world are way over leveraged because there's no equity involved. And then something else. So we've created a royalty-based kind of approach to investment. There's only one other place in the world that does it, and it's a South African firm that we brought in, as a matter of fact, to help us set it up. So I think blended finance really matters a whole lot. That it's not, that I don't think any of us can do a sort of plain vanilla, you get a little debt and you get a little equity kind of thing. You just can't do that. The answer, the gut answer to the question of why not, well, just hand it over.
Just hand over to HSBC.
Sure. There's one of the more important business books ever written is called The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen. And what that basically says is that foreign bodies in the middle of large companies are rejected and killed. And it answers the question for two things. Why is it that virtually all of the job creation in developed countries comes from small companies, not big companies? For that reason. Why is it that the vast, vast majority of the past path-breaking innovations that have occurred in developed economies are from small companies, not big companies? Because big companies, while they have their very valuable purpose, and they are, and there are lots of very smart Nobel Prize-winning economists who've talked about the necessary mix of big and small, they are not where growth happens. And if you handed these things off, they would kill every one of them off in a minute.
Having worked at Citibank in Argentina in the commercial banking sector, I agree with you, actually.
Right.
All right, Kim and Paige, I want to give each of you a chance to make 30 or 45 seconds of just a closing point, and then I'm going to give Jim the last word.
I was going to give you another example. One of the big problems with SME financing is that it's not profitable for most large institutions, which is why the SME sector is underserved in every single economy, including this one. So therefore, one of the things that we did was by demonstrating that you could underwrite a 5-year commercial loan, you could actually monitor it, and you could collect payments. We were able to demonstrate to the existing banking system that they should, in fact, get into that business. Once they got into that business, we went to them and said, okay, now that you're going to do the 5-year term loan, we're going to do the non-cash pay preferred below you to give growth capital. So it's not blended in the sense of a blended security, but it was blended on an ad hoc basis to reflect the company's needs and the state of the capital markets. Again, going back to my point, which is that if there's one thing that I would leave with this is flexibility in the execution of the business plan is the sine qua non of success, because no one can predict in advance where the opportunities will be in any country in which an enterprise fund is stood up.
Thank you. Okay, I just want to make one other point. So Kim, Jim, and Bo ain't in this for the bucks, right? I mean, I'm sure the salary is phenomenal, right? You guys have gotten no money out of being the chairs of these things, right? Is that correct? Okay. Well,
I'll add to that.
So this right. So this is public service. This is phenomenal. This is voluntary public service. So thank you.
The one thing that gets in my crop, I bought into that when we did it, is there's an absolute rule in our piece of the legislation against a penny being spent on alcohol. Now, you can understand that. But Tunisia's a real place. It's businessmen and businesswomen have a glass of wine before dinner and that kind of thing, and if I take them out. So guess who for 5 years has bought all the beer and all the alcohol?
Thanks, Bo. Thanks for your public.
But the Baltics do not have that problem. I want to be clear.
Okay, Paige.
It's part of the public-private partnership, right? No, I was going to make the same comment Dan did. The fact that Kim and Bo and Jim have done this, and I would say the board chairs from most of the other funds, really, we are forever indebted as taxpayers to the fact that you stepped up and took this on. And I think that that is something that has to be recognized if there is to be an Enterprise Fund 2.0, that people are willing to do it. And as Hugh said, there are other people out there willing to do it. But it's a role public-private partnership. And so thank you for all that you've done for this.
Yeah, can I just ask her? Okay, Jim, you get the last word. So, Jim, did you ever think that, were there any moment you said, gosh, why the heck did I sign up for this assignment?
I want to answer 3 questions. First, I'll just answer that briefly. Of course, the first trip I made, we had a scheduled meeting with the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood. It was late at night, and we were in a State Department car, but fortunately not a State Department flag or a U.S. government flag. Otherwise, I might not be here. But this car chose to go in front of the protests taking place in the square, and we were stopped. And we did have security in the car, and they said, when the tear gas comes, you shouldn't get out of the car, because dressed as we were, we would not make it to the corner. So we sat for 2.5 hours, and I could only look at then my BlackBerry, which I always try to make some humor out of the whole thing. The first message on my BlackBerry was that my dentist expected me Monday morning at 9 o'clock for a dental appointment. And I thought, God, if I ever get there, I'll be so happy. But so at that moment,
Just bring me a root canal.
At that moment, I did think that lucky I'm in it for the big bucks. But we did get to the meeting with the leadership. I didn't tell my wife, actually. She would have been furious. But we did get to the meeting, and the first hour I unloaded on then leadership, saying that that's the way you're going to treat potential foreign investors who are coming here. And the funny thing about it, that evening the Brotherhood made a proposal to us that they would like to co-venture the enterprise fund. And they thought they had the knowledge and skill to do that. And so we had a lengthy night. As you may know, those meetings go into a long time. Anyway, it was at that moment. I wanted to make just 3 brief comments on more serious matters, so to speak, since I've tried to forget about that moment. Additionality we think about all the time. That's a very important issue. And so I wouldn't make light of that. Directors, thanks the gentleman who raised that question. We'll certainly keep that in mind. It's interesting that I never expected that to get to be a director of the Egyptian American Enterprise Fund became a bit of a hot ticket. In other words, getting paid nothing. We have more people, both who are Egyptian citizens and U.S. citizens, who, when they hear about it, have volunteered to do this, and some very good people. A very important message for anybody in this audience who is going to someday run an enterprise fund: don't pick the highest profile, best known television people, so to speak. So give you an illustration of a wonderful man who was very, very, very considerate. Mohammed El Arian and I talked about it, and he is so busy he wouldn't have had the time to come to meetings, but he cared what we were doing. So try to find people who really will work, come to the meetings, and are engaged. Our board is very much engaged, but I like the suggestion you made, and we'll certainly keep that in mind. I also would say, if I had to change one thing, I wish they allowed me to be an investor in the enterprise fund. That would have sent the right signal, and I would have loved to put my own personal funds into the enterprise fund. They don't allow that right now. Maybe there's both pluses and minuses to doing that in terms of conflicts, but that's another subject. In spite of the one incident that I have answered Dan's question, always felt that it was very worthwhile doing. I'm fortunate to have been asked, and I'm fortunate that I made the decision to do it, and I don't regret that in any way. Thank you all for going. By the way, if anybody in this audience has listened to this and thought we could do something different, probably any of us, and thought I would welcome comments or suggestions or email to that effect, that we can all learn by other people's experiences, so I would encourage you. So there's a gentleman in the back who's waving his hand.
I was managing the Robert Simmons, former USAID Foreign Service. I was managing the Central Enterprise Investment Funds, as well as sitting in on the board meetings, and I was involved with the South Africa Enterprise Development Fund, SADC. And a couple of quick thoughts. One thing for PAIGE is, when going forward with investment version number 2, I think it's important to bring in the Foreign Service people. And that early on in that discussion, because we're on the field, we live there in these communities, and we have a good pulse of what's happening inside the communities, and in terms of also the investment in the economic communities. Secondly, I think in terms of lessons learned, I've noticed that a lot of the investments that were made had multi-purposes and multi-functions. I know the board brought up the issues of social capital, as well as the financial imperative, which is the internal rates of return and net present values. This is important to have the people in USAID understand this. Lots of USAID people don't understand this, and it gets very complicated. And I was managing 5 countries, and it's hard to be able to communicate that to them in a way that makes sense. Nonetheless, we're still getting pressure. We would get a lot of pressure from the embassy to provide some sort of results. So I would have to push back on the investment fund, give us something. What can you give us? because if they don't give us anything, it makes our job a bit more substantially more difficult. And finally, I'd like to say is I think it's important to have folks on the ground early on, because I noticed that some of the investments, there was so much pressure to put out successes, it lost sight of some of the social needs that had to affect the communities, because the investment funds would, when I was there in Central, is that they would look for the winners, of course, and then they would invest those funds with the winners. So if they put, for example, if they put in a bank that was having 18% return, they would do stuff like that. And then they would have returns of 18%, which is a bit misleading, I would argue, and I'm sure some of you folks would agree. So I think some of those thoughts, if you could take that into consideration,
Thank you.
That'd be quite helpful.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Jim, you have any further comments? Okay. All right. Please join me in thanking the panel. Thank you.